Hello and welcome to Useful Idiots Monday Morning, where we react to the Sunday morning news shows that we watch so that you don't have to. I'm Katie Halper.
And I'm Aaron Maté. Good Monday morning, everybody. Thanks for being here with us. If you're watching the show live, remember to like the stream. And our website, as always, is usefulidiots.podcast.com. And we have another chock-filled, jam-packed Monday morning for you.
Yeah. So tweet it out, guys. Give us a like. That helps the algorithm. And as we've mentioned before, there's so much Hasbara, Israeli propaganda, and so much American propaganda that we need to debunk. So we got to make sure that people are watching this. And a way you can do that is by sharing the link, liking, and subscribing. All righty. Let's take a look at our first clip, which, of course, comes from Meet the Press.
Sunday morning. Good Sunday morning. In many ways, this week has felt like an inflection point, with Israel's war against Hamas intensifying and claiming more lives. And tensions boiling over here at home about how to address hate speech. Adding to the mix with less.
And of course, she's taking for granted that the allegations of hate speech are founded.
Yes, as we're going to see, what is called hate speech is basically people, college kids, calling for Palestinian freedom.
Right.
And because donors and media elites and members of Congress can't handle that, the answer to supposed hate speech is censorship. And that's what has been, once again, totally normalized this week, as we're going to get into.
Yeah.
Less than a week to go before lawmakers leave Washington, there is still no deal on Israel and Ukraine aid. NBC News has learned that the White House is expecting to ramp up its outreach to Capitol Hill this week. But a senior administration official is making it clear the engagement will depend on having a clear framework on border negotiations to work from. And that hasn't happened yet. Earlier this week, President Biden signaled he is ready to make a deal.
I am willing to make significant compromises on the border. We need to fix the broken border system. It is broken.
Okay, so listen, there's a little shout out to all the progressives who've sided with Joe Biden in his Ukraine proxy war, which, if you recall, was a huge issue for everybody until Israel began this genocide in Gaza. And understandably, it just hasn't gotten as much attention. But Biden desperately needs $60 billion to prolong the Ukraine war because it's going terribly for him, as was predicted on places like this show. And so to do that, he's now willing to basically further militarize the border and make it even harder for undocumented immigrants to claim asylum. So progressives, because they've gone along with Biden on Ukraine to this point, have now put him in a position where he, in order to keep the war going, is probably going to make it even more inhumane for undocumented immigrants to cave to Republicans to meet their demands for funding the Ukraine war. So that's just one example of why it's dangerous to get into bed with neocons. Because neocons are always going to sell out everybody to keep their projects going.
Right. These are progressives apparently like Biden because he wasn't going to put kids in cages or build that wall. And he's doing both.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
By the way, I just want to read a comment because I think this is relevant. Someone writes, I'm a little behind on the stream, but is there no mention on the captives in Gaza who were stripped naked and shipped out on the back of trucks? Well, that's an important thing to remind people of. And guess what was not mentioned at all on any of the news shows? That. So that's just a striking thing that's one of the many things that were omitted. And that is very newsworthy. Okay.
Journal poll, just 27% approve of the president's handling of securing the border, 64% disapprove. NBC News has also learned a number of Hispanic and Latino members of Congress, as well as advocacy groups, are becoming increasingly concerned that President Biden may strike a deal with Republicans on immigration that they find unacceptable in order to secure passage of his Ukraine and Israel package. The fear, according to one Capitol Hill Democrat, the president will accept border policy changes proposed by Republicans that are, quote, unimaginably cruel. Now, looming over all of it, the 2024.
Yes, because Democrats united to give him a proxy war in Ukraine that also was unimaginably cruel for the world. And again, because Biden has no morals, he has no principles, he will cave to Republicans to give them whatever they want to keep his Ukraine war going because it's such a disaster. So that's one example of like an unintended consequence of siding with neocons to give them wars is you create a void for them to fill. And Biden is going to fill that now by making it harder for people to claim asylum. That's what it looks like, at least, as we're recording this.
Race for the White House and new controversial comments by former President Donald Trump. In a Fox News interview this week, he was pressed several times to say categorically that he would not abuse his presidential power if elected to a second term. Mr. Trump declined to give a denial.
You are promising America tonight you would never abuse power as retribution against anybody.
Except for day one.
Except
Look,
for?
he's going crazy. Except for day one.
Meaning?
I want to close the border and
Look at the way he's sitting, by the way. It's insane.
Interesting pose, yeah. Interesting
Yeah.
pose. Yeah. He's leaning in.
He's leaning in, yeah.
I want to drill.
That's
drill,
not that's
drill.
that's not
No, no.
that's not retribution. I got
I'm gonna be, you know, he keeps we love this guy. He says, "You're not gonna be a dictator, are you?" I said, no, other than day one.
What a ham he is.
What a ham indeed, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Well,
And I like watching Sean Hannity try to run interference for him. That's not, you're not going to, there's no retribution there. Yeah.
okay. Well, let's turn to a staple of the show. We see him a lot now. He is, his job officially is to be a diplomat, right? That's his job title, Secretary of State.
Technically, yeah.
Technically diplomat. Functionally, he does anything but.
Yeah.
Here he is, Anthony Blinken on CNN justifying why his government just vetoed a UN measure calling for a ceasefire in Gaza.
U.S. stood alone at the UN Security Council on Friday to block the ceasefire, and the administration is sidestepping Congress to rush more weapons to Israel. You said this week that there is, quote, a gap between the intent to protect Palestinian civilians and the actual results that we're seeing on the ground in Gaza. Can you describe that gap? What is Israel doing right now that you think does not demonstrate enough care or protection of Palestinian civilians?
What a strange way to describe a genocide where half the population, according to the UN, is starving, where people are being murdered every day in airstrikes, in these ground assaults, where the death toll of children now is, I mean, officially it's over 10,000, but I'm sure even that's an undercount.
Right. Because there are people literally under the rubble and they don't have the fuel required to dig them out.
Yeah. And listen to this like ambiguous, neutered language that Jake Tapper uses. There's a gap between what you say Israel should be doing and what Israel's actually doing. A gap. Like,
well, he's not even saying there's a gap. He's saying that Blinken is saying that there's a gap. And he's like, where's this gap?
Yeah, right. Where's
Show us
proof
the gap.
Yeah. Show us the gap. Yeah.
Jake, we think there needs to be a premium put on protecting civilians and making sure that humanitarian assistance can get to everyone who needs it. And as I said, I think the intent is there, but the results are not always manifesting themselves. And we see that both in terms of civilian protection and humanitarian assistance. We want to make sure
the results are not manifesting. I think that Israel just needs to manifest. Like, they need to read The Secret or The Power of Attraction so that they can manifest, put it out into the universe that they don't want to commit a genocide.
And he says we need to put a premium on civilian protection. Like,
gross.
what weird, cold language
Insurance,
is that? Like,
insurance
yeah,
policy language.
exactly.
Yeah.
Like, is he selling like an insurance policy to Israel? Like, they're massacring people. They're blocking aid. I mean, he touted all those trucks that were coming in to give aid to Gazans. Like, it's now at less of a level of aid deliveries than it was during the so-called pause that happened last month. It's just so anyway. Let's hear more.
Disgusting.
Sure, that as Israel continues this campaign, because remember, they are dealing with a terrorist organization that engaged in the most vicious possible brutality on October 7th, and has made clear that it would do it again and again and again if given the opportunity. So Israel needs to be able to deal with this to protect itself, to prevent October 7th from happening again. But as it does that,
I want to say one thing about this happening again and again, because a lot of people are making this argument. They're kind of like, what is Israel supposed to do when Hamas has said that they'll do October 7th again and again, which a Hamas person did say. But two things. One is, of course, you could just end the occupation. But even within the framework of people who are for the occupation with the what is Israel supposed to do thing, Hamas was saying that they did not intend to target. I mean, you can agree, take them at their word or not, but what their point is, and the guy didn't do the best job of putting this out there, but he was saying that they didn't mean to target all these or kill all these civilians. By October 7th, he means attacks on combatants and the Israeli military, the occupying forces. But of course, for Israelis, they have an inverted value system where soldiers' lives are worth more than civilians' lives.
Yeah, and like what Blinken's saying, it's basically terrorist logic. It's saying that, you have the right to kill as many civilians as you want in order to defend yourself. Well, that logic also then applies to October 7th, because it's not as if before October 7th, Palestinians were safe. Palestinians were under occupation. They had faced constant attacks from Israel. And so by the logic that Blinken's pointing out, then October 7th was just Palestinians' way of defending themselves from future attacks by Israel. It's terror logic. And in fact, Palestinians have a much better argument to say that because they're occupied. Israel's not. And occupiers don't have self-defense rights. They just have obligations to end the occupation. That's, of course, you can't mention even the word occupation anymore on corporate TV. And what I heard from that Hamas leader who said that was that they're going to keep resisting Israel, which is what occupied people do. And if you don't want them to resist, then don't occupy them. And by the way, if you compare October 7th to what Israel's mass murder campaign now, the percentage of armed Israelis that were killed on October 7th is a lot higher than armed militants that are being killed right now.
Right. That's a really important point.
It's true. I mean, like the official Israeli toll is about 1,200. So, and about 400 of those were Israeli soldiers and police. The rest were civilians. Again, that's taking the Israeli stats at face value. And previously, they've already had to revise those stats because initially they said it was 1,400, but then they realized that actually 200 of those were burned Palestinians that Israel killed with its own helicopters. So anyway, taking the Israeli stats at face value, which I think is a leap, still the Palestinian militant kill ratio to civilians is like Israel's kill ratio is far more civilians than Hamas killed on October 7th.
Right. Yeah. And also Israel can't, like, under international law, they can't declare self-defense under Article 51 of the UN Charter because they're occupying the territory.
Yeah, and Palestine's not even a state. Like the UN Charter deals with attacks among states. Palestine's not even a state. They're actually occupied by Israel. They're de facto within the Israeli state because Israel controls everything in Gaza. It's insane, and like Israel doesn't have the right to fire a single bullet into Gaza. They don't. They just had the obligation then to end the occupation. But this fanatical occupation supporter doesn't care about that. and he wants to give them a continued green light for more killing.
Right.
It's imperative that civilians be protected. And here, the critical thing is to make sure that the military operations are designed around civilian protection and to focus on that. When it comes to humanitarian assistance, that we, as you know, made the argument many weeks ago to get humanitarian assistance in. It started to flow. We got it doubled during the humanitarian pause for the hostage releases that we helped to negotiate.
And now it's less than half than what it was before. So he's basically repeating all the things he said all along, that we need to do better, we need to protect civilians, all while on the ground in real life, right in front of our eyes, the mass murder is proceeding. The U.S. is doing nothing to stop it. Right. They're, as Kirsten Welker said earlier, they're sidestepping congressional review to rush new weapons to Israel. They're supplying the same 2,000-pound bunker buster bombs that are meant for, like, conventional wars, not like dropping on like densely populated defenseless areas. They're doing absolutely everything the same that they've done before, even as Israel continues to kill people en masse, and there's no consequences whatsoever.
Right. And it's now going on week 4 of saying this, that they are encouraging Israel to, be cautious with civilians. There's obviously no doubt that they're not sincere and that they're just providing empty cover for ethnic cleansing, because nothing has changed. And the other thing is, as you pointed out, Biden went around, he sidestepped Congress, right? And Biden himself just approved the emergency sale to Israel of nearly 14,000 rounds of tank ammunition worth more than $106 million, as Israel is intensifying this and killing civilians. So somehow he can bypass Congress to do that, but he can't get Israel to do anything to protect civilians. Come on, give us a fucking break.
Okay, well, just for a contrast to Blinken, let's check in with the head of Save the Children.
Yeah, let's see what she has to say about how careful they're being with civilians.
The U.S. vetoed that ceasefire call at the United Nations. And afterwards, your organization released a statement, said Israel is forcing civilians into so-called safe zones that cannot accommodate them and, quote, deliberately depriving the civilian population of food, water, and fuel, willfully impeding relief supplies, and using starvation as a method of warfare. That is a very strong allegation in that press release yesterday. Why do you say this is deliberate?
Look, humanitarian organizations like ours, we're really running out of words to describe how bad it is. We work in crises all over the world, from Afghanistan to Sudan, to Ethiopia, to the Democratic Republic of Congo. So we are no strangers to war and conflict. Mm-hmm. But what is happening here is that there's 2 million people, 1 million children in a very, very small space. There is no way to get out. Nobody can flee, which is not the case in most of these other crises. And there is nothing coming in, and there's an absence of basic necessities. So the siege that's put upon the people of Gaza is not, we cannot do it. There is no market of sorts to allow people to get access to food and water and anything they need. So we think that is a willful,
it's a choice.
It's a choice. It's a choice, and it's withholding aid from the population.
Disgusting. A lot of people like to pretend, oh, this is just war. First of all, it's not a war. It's an occupier attacking. It's the occupied territory. But they like to pretend, oh, this is just wars. Unfortunate people die, as opposed to what this is, which is targeted, intentional killing of civilians and deprivation and starvation of civilians.
And we have more from the head of Save the Children,
who I guess is an anti-Semite, is what Israel defenders would say.
We knew half of the residents of Gaza before the war were children. For those who have survived the war to date, what is life like for them?
It's an unbelievable humanitarian catastrophe, Margaret. We have no access to basic services. There is an absence of clean water. We saw in the earlier segment children drinking dirty water from a pipe on the ground. The rainy season has started. There is sewage in the streets. There is no food. There is no electricity. Most of the hospitals are not functioning anymore. There's no electricity. It is unspeakable, essentially, what's unfolding before our eyes. And humanitarian agencies cannot help the population of Gaza and those children in the current situation.
Cannot help them. Why? Is that because there is only this one open gate at present to allow aid in, and Israel's screening it all?
That is one of the issues as well. But in the current, I mean, when the humanitarian pause happened a few days ago for 7 days, those 7 days were not enough. You cannot really rebuild a warehouse in 7 days. But there was aid coming in. We could even deliver some of those supplies, even without fuel, the necessary fuel to get stuff all the way up to the north. But currently, with all this violence, the attacks, the shelling, the violence, we cannot go out and deliver safely. We also cannot ask families and children to come out and receive those deliveries, because that is not safe either. People are putting up tents in the middle of the road because that's the only way to get shelter currently.
Okay, well, so that's the reality on the ground. And back to the guy whose job it is to fuel that crisis and ignore the people of Gaza, not just ignore them, to actually immiserate them and support their murder, is Anthony Blinken. Here he is speaking to ABC News.
The guy who's responsible in part for the suffering we just learned about. We just heard about. Yeah.
Mr. Secretary, I assume that that answer is the same when it comes to the U.S. being the only country to vote against a UN ceasefire resolution on Friday.
We have been a strong proponent of humanitarian pauses. In fact, because of our advocacy, because of the work we did, we got pauses. We got pauses on a daily basis to make sure that people could get out of the way, that humanitarian supplies could get in. We helped negotiate the longer pause that resulted in the release of.
People could get out of the way of what? Of like being bombed in their homes? Because they're still being bombed in their homes no matter what. And there's no safe zones to go to. So when people flee, they get killed. When people shelter, they get killed. He's living in a complete. He's lying through his teeth. He knows what the reality is.
Right.
And he gets away with it. He goes on TV on these shows. He's not challenged on anything. We haven't heard a single challenge of him so far on any of these shows.
So disgusting.
More than 110 hostages, and that also allowed a doubling of humanitarian assistance that was getting into Gaza. But when it comes to a ceasefire in this moment, with Hamas still alive, still intact.
Again, so it's like everything he says is a lie, but when he says we've doubled humanitarian assistance, you could say to him right now, well, the UN says that half the people of Gaza are starving. So where is this doubling of humanitarian assistance? Right. Maybe these hosts don't know that. I don't know. Maybe their producers don't give them like the basic
information. Right.
Yeah. But everything he says is basically a lie.
And again, with the stated intent of repeating October 7th again and again and again, that would simply perpetuate the problem. And so our focus is on trying to make sure that civilians are protected to the maximum extent possible, that humanitarian assistance gets in to the maximum extent possible. And again.
So it's not that civilians are protected, period, and not that humanitarian assistance gets in, period. It's that these things happen to the extent possible.
Right, exactly.
Which means zilch. There's zero possibility because Israel's conducting an extermination campaign. That's pretty much what he's saying.
And a new letter, by the way, came out signed by dozens of academics, including Israeli Jews, saying that Israel is engaging in genocide.
All right.
You know what? I just want to point out another thing that, if Israel is so worried about attacks on it, a great way to not deal with that is by killing tens of thousands of people who have children and relatives that'll basically hate you forever. And if they want to respond to things like October 7th, the cheapest, most humane and effective way of doing that would be just acting on your own intelligence when it tells you an attack is imminent. But anyway. They don't want to do that because that's not what this is about. This is about ethnic cleansing the area, not self-defense.
Okay, let's go back to Antony Blinken, and he's going to pat Jake Tapper on the head because Jake Tapper has been, as Jake Tapper says, leading the way in covering Hamas's alleged sexual violence on October 7th. And this is a touchy subject because that's a very serious allegation. But missing in all of this is any actual evidence, as we've discussed, and we're going to see more of in a second. And we've only seen this allegation resurface as criticism of Israel has intensified because it's committing a mass murder campaign. So Secretary Blinken is going to appreciate Jake Tapper for once again bringing up these allegations, which in reality lack actual evidence. But that doesn't matter to Blinken and Jake Tapper.
Also, I just want to give CNN a shout out because they've really been doing a lot of heavy lifting on this. Like they remember it was Dana Bash who slammed Pramila Jayapal for apparently not condemning this, even though she said it was mass rape without any evidence of that. It was Biana, whose last name I can't pronounce, another CNN journalist who's been tweeting about this and pushing this, and Jake Tapper.
Yeah, and there's the same network that, if you remember, back when the current lie was dozens of beheaded babies by Hamas, CNN just repeated that, said it was confirmed because the Israeli government said it was true. They were forced to admit that, in fact, it was a lie. But that's the playbook. Just after one lie is debunked, pivot to a new allegation, even if there's no evidence to support it. And I think that's what we're seeing here when it comes to these mass rape allegations.
Yeah.
But let's see what Jake Tapper and Blinken have to say.
And it's Biana Golodriga. Sorry, Golodriga is how you say your last name. Okay.
Has led the coverage. CNN has led the coverage when it comes to the evidence mounting in Israel of rapes and sex crimes committed by Hamas against women and girls, maybe even against men, on October 7th. Why do you think the United Nations and the international community has been so slow to condemn these atrocities? I can't think of a real reason. Well, let me just put it this way. I've heard anti-Semitism hypothesized as a reason why the UN and the international community might be so slow to acknowledge this.
Okay.
What do you think?
This is so disgusting. He's basically putting into the form of a question, an allegation, a smear against the UN that they don't acknowledge this because they're anti-Semites. So the problem is that's an absurd thing to say. Second of all, they do acknowledge this and they're looking into this. And in fact, they're trying to have Israel help them with an investigation. And Israel, surprisingly enough, is refusing to cooperate with them. Why? Because they're allegedly anti-Semitic. But they are not ignoring this. They are trying to look into this. But Israel, of course, doesn't want to cooperate because they probably don't have the standards of investigation that the UN would require before condemning something. And again, this is November 29th that the UN Secretary General called for an investigation into the allegations.
Yeah, Israel is not cooperating because they don't have evidence. There's no physical evidence of sexual assault. There was none collected from any of the victims of October 7th. There are no purported survivors of sexual violence. The only so-called evidence comes from alleged witnesses, and some of them come from a scam organization called Zaka, which Max Blumenthal just exposed at the Gray Zone as being responsible for some of the other allegations from October 7th that have already been debunked, including beheaded babies. So the reason why maybe the UN has not condemned this yet is because there's no evidence for it. And if Israel had evidence, it would turn it over, but it doesn't. It just wants people like Jake Tapper to nod their head and parrot these allegations without evidence. And it's pretty clear why. It's because Israel and its supporters need something to distract from the actual atrocities that they're committing right now every single day in Gaza. And Blinken is appreciative of Jake Tapper's efforts to parrot these claims with no evidence. So he's going to pat Jake Tapper on the head.
And also, Jake Tapper gets to play the bad cop to link to Blinken's good cop. So Jake Tapper basically gets to say, it's because they're anti-Semites, right? And Blinken gets to be reasonable and not take the bait, but they got it into the discourse.
Jake, first, I really applaud the extraordinary work of CNN in bringing this to light and bringing this before the world. You performed a remarkable service in doing that. As to your question,
what he means by remarkable service is he providing a service to Israel's genocide campaign, because now the conversation gets shifted back to October 7th. All of a sudden, you have witnesses emerging for the first time, which is curious in itself, and their claims are ridiculous. And I've talked about one of them. This one alleged witness, a man, says that he witnessed a beautiful woman with the face of an angel, that's quoting him, being raped by 8 to 10 Hamas militants. And then he says that he saw another Hamas militant take a shovel and behead a woman, and her head rolled in front of him. That's what this alleged witness says. And there's no other supporting evidence for it. That, coupled with the fact that the story is only emerging now, raises questions, and it requires evidence. And Jake Tapper doesn't care about that, so he's just been parroting this stuff. And there was an article in Mondo Weiss pointing out that the sources for Jake Tapper's so-called reporting are all dubious, and a lot of them have Israeli government ties, and they've been put out there in previous to put out previous stories that turned out to be false, and their claims don't add up. So that's what happens when you fact check Jake Tapper. Is it turns out what he's saying is not supported by the actual facts.
And let's actually take a look at this New Yorker article that just came out, an interview, because I think it speaks to the standards of investigation. And this is something that CNN is relying on. So just go to the next. The article is called "How Hamas Used Sexual Violence on October 7th." Physicians for Human Rights Israel. Wait, go back. Physicians for Human Rights Israel issued a report collecting evidence of sexual and gender-based violence. One of its authors lays out their findings, and here's some of the things that they said. Okay, what do we know about the sexual violence that occurred on October 7th? Our position paper is based on materials that we collected from public media outlets and videos we saw in groups on Telegram, as well as discussions with a legal advisor and a doctor who volunteers with a civil society group that's supporting the hostages and the families. We haven't interviewed actual witnesses. Next. Our decision was not to approach the actual victims or the eyewitnesses because we thought that this was too short of a time afterward and that we were not equipped to talk to them and treat them. Okay, next. I think there's one more. Is there one more screenshot? Or no, I guess there isn't one more screenshot. But I linked to that whole article, but that's just an example of the kinds of investigation and evidence that Jake Tapper et al. Are relying on.
Okay, back to Blinken.
An answer. I don't know why countries, leaders, international organizations were so slow to focus on this, to bring it to people's attention. I'm glad it's finally happened. The atrocities that we saw on October 7th are almost beyond human description or beyond our capacity to digest. And we've talked about them before, but the sexual violence that we saw on October 7th is beyond anything that I've seen either. So,
what did you see? And what exactly did he see? There's no purported survivor of this alleged sexual violence, and there's no physical evidence. So what exactly did Blinken see? We know already that Israel's been caught publishing a photograph that it claimed was evidence of sexual violence. It turns out was not even taken inside Israel, wasn't on October 7th. It was of a Kurdish fighter from a few years ago, and they had to delete that from their purported collection of evidence. Max Blumenthal also pointed that out. So what exactly did Antony Blinken see? He doesn't specify here. And he talks about, the atrocities on October 7th were unlike anything we've ever seen. When have we seen in recent memory a concentration camp full of civilians, more than half of them are children, being massacred with powerful bunker busting bombs? So somehow October 7th now is a worse atrocity than thousands upon thousands of Palestinians being slaughtered every single day. The death toll now in Gaza far outnumbers what happened on October 7th. Basically, almost in one day, Israel kills as many civilians in Gaza as were killed on October 7th. So what is he talking about, saying that we haven't seen something like this before?
Well, also, even, I mean, it's just people who were killed, you can still do analysis of their forensic analysis to see if they were raped. And they haven't been doing that either. So it's not like,
they did not do it, and it's too late now, according to the Israeli press. And when I pointed this out on Twitter, a lot of people took offense to me saying that, but it's in the Israeli press. There's no physical evidence, and it's too late for that. And on what basis then are they making all these claims? And part of it, I think, is this kind of racist caricature of Arab Muslim men as these like Muslim hordes wanting to go around and rape Jewish women. I think that's a large basis for this belief that this happened. I'm not saying it didn't happen, but I'm saying if you're going to make that allegation, you have to have evidence for it, and they haven't provided that yet.
And you can't block an investigation.
No, you can't block an investigation. And what they have provided previously are a series of other debunked allegations. So anything these people say should be taken at face value.
Right.
But yet, when you don't take it at face value, you're accused of denying atrocities, when all you're doing is asking for evidence, which Jake Tapper and Nancy Blinken don't have.
Right. And again, it's important to point out that CNN covering allegations does not rise to the level of an investigation, which is what Jake Tapper and Anthony Blinken would like you to believe, that they've done investigation. They haven't. They've just covered allegations. And again, the UN, he said that they're not acknowledging it. No, they did acknowledge it. Not only did they acknowledge it, but they called for an investigation, and they are trying to investigate. And they did this as early as November. These people are such liars. And it's just disgusting because they know that people aren't going to want to push back on this because they don't want to be called rape deniers. And so that's why it's such a useful tool for them. And look, I'm not saying that rape didn't happen. I'm saying that we don't yet have the evidence to support that it has happened. And we certainly don't have the evidence that it was systemic.
Okay, let's move on. Let's check in with Bernie Sanders. He did vote against a recent Senate measure to give Israel another $10 billion for its mass murder campaign.
And he has been talking about conditioning aid. He's been trying to condition aid.
Mm-hmm.
Israel says it's killed 7,000 militants. They haven't explained how many civilians they estimate they've killed. The U.S. says they can't tally it. The number you cited there is from the Gaza Ministry of Health. But the bottom line here is I know you have been very clear to your colleagues the U.S. should not provide more aid to Israel, to the Netanyahu government, with no strings attached, you wrote, because it would make the U.S. complicit. You said, quote, in an all-out war against innocent men, women, and children who have nothing to do with Hamas. What do you believe the Netanyahu government's intent is here?
Hard to say. It really is hard to say. It may be that there was.
Wait, also, is he calling in on like a speakerphone? What's going on? Kind of funny quality.
Responding in rage against the horrific and terrible Hamas attack that killed 1,200 innocent Israelis. Maybe in some of the right-wing extremist minds, there is the goal to drive the Palestinian people off of Gaza completely.
Maybe. We have a newspaper article from Israel reporting on the fact that Netanyahu tapped Ron Dermer to, quote unquote, thin out the population of Gaza. So I think you can say that with more confidence than maybe.
But they have now destroyed about half of the housing units in Gaza. So it's hard to predict. But I think when General Austin said you can.
Why is it hard to say? If like right before your eyes, they're massacring people, destroying everyone's homes, and calling for people to be removed. Why can't you just say it's easy to say this is ethnic cleansing? That's what Israel's goal is. I mean, at least
they've said it out loud. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, like I guess credit to him for acknowledging some of what's happening, although it still doesn't capture just how evil it is. But it's not hard to say. It's easy to say because Israelis even say it. Their goal is ethnic
Right.
cleansing. They
Where
wanted
has
to
he
destroy
been?
Gaza.
Amalek?
Yeah. And again, look, it's important if you're going to put out these figures, it's important to be accurate. So it's not 1,200 innocent civilians on October 7th. It was the official civilian toll by Israel is around 800. The rest were soldiers and police. And those soldiers are there to enforce an occupation. So they're military targets. They're not civilian. And it doesn't justify killing them, but you also have to be accurate if you're going to put out these figures.
Win the battle but lose the war. Israel is losing the war in terms of how the world is looking at this situation. And I think that it would be irresponsible for the United States to give Netanyahu another $10 billion to continue to wage this awful war.
Okay, so Bernie is at least opposed to giving Israel more of a blank check to continue this mass murder campaign. But then he gets to the issue of, okay, well, what about like a permanent ceasefire with Hamas? So this would be a way to stop the war. And his message is so incoherent that while he opposes continuing to arm Israel with billions of dollars in U.S. weapons, he does not support a ceasefire with Hamas, which makes his position kind of
Not a
incoherent.
permanent ceasefire, yeah.
Yeah. So here he is on that.
Progressives like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Rashida Tlaib have been clear in calling for a ceasefire. You've taken some flack because you have not. The United States government is opposing a ceasefire as well, and they're isolated at the UN on that point. Why is it you oppose a ceasefire?
Well, first of all, I strongly support and wish and hope that the United States will support the United Nations resolution that was vetoed, that we vetoed the other day. That was a humanitarian pause, a humanitarian ceasefire that would have, by the way, called for the release of all of the hostages held by Hamas and would have allowed the UN and other agencies to begin to supply the enormous amount of humanitarian aid that the Palestinian people. In terms of a permanent ceasefire, I don't know how you could have a permanent ceasefire with Hamas, who has said before October 7th and after October 7th that they want to destroy Israel. They want a permanent war. I don't know how you have a permanent ceasefire with an attitude like that.
Well, it's very easy.
What if you're occupying them, right? And you've been besieging them for more than a decade. You've stolen their land. You've displaced. What if you actually address the occupation and the displacement of Palestinians? Like, why don't you start with that? That's the minimum that Israel and the U.S. have to do because they're responsible for that. Start with what you're responsible for. So stop occupying them and then see if possible you can come to some sort of long-term truce, which Hamas, by the way, has proposed in the past, which the U.S. and Israel have ignored. And if you're going to say you can't have peace with people when they call to destroy you, then why isn't he applying that to Israel, which is constantly talked about wiping out Palestinians? And not just one Hamas member who is Bernie's quoting here, but a number of Israeli leaders have called for exterminating Palestinians, and ethnically cleansing them, and vowing to continue attacking them.
I mean, Gideon Levy, the Israeli journalist at Haaretz, talked to us about Israel's Nazi proposals to use biological warfare, and saying how you had an Israeli general saying how epidemics would be useful. But also this whole thing about what is Israel supposed to do? You know what Israel could do? They could follow the law. They could stop massacring civilians. They could end the siege. They could enter into international talks. And if they wanted to go after Hamas, they could seek accountability for Hamas war crimes through courts. It's not this, whoa, what is Israel to do besides genocide? It's not even what is Israel. It's even if you don't want to end the occupation, which obviously we should be. But I'm saying even within the more liberal Zionist framework, those are all the things you can do.
Okay, more from Bernie. He's going to be asked about this new so-called controversy that erupted this week when basically the president of Penn University was forced to resign because during a congressional hearing, she was basically asked a really misleading question. And the question is basically like, are calls for the genocide of Jews allowed on campus? And the president of Penn made some comments about respecting free speech and then was forced to resign because of that. But the problem is what she didn't do is challenge the presumption that we're hearing calls for genocide of Jews. What we're actually hearing on campus are people defending Palestinian rights by saying things like, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. And extremist fanatics who oppose minimal Palestinian rights, who oppose Palestinian freedom, take those calls for Palestinian freedom as a call for genocide of Jews, and then ask people, why aren't you condemning that?
I think maybe they're projecting because they are saying from the river to the sea, Palestine will not be free. And what they have right now is Israeli occupation from the river to the sea, which is genocidal.
Yes. So because nobody will call out the premise of the question as being false, that like these are not calls for genocide, you have this debate right now, basically the stake debate of like, what are we going to do about calls for genocide on campus? When really the answer is there are no calls for genocide on campus. The only genocide going on is the one unfolding with our support right now inside of Gaza.
Yeah, and these are people who are
this fake debate is an effort to distract from that.
Also, you should be a little like suspicious of something being led by Elise Stefanik, who is a major MAGA Republican who has supported replacement theory. Maybe, just maybe, she's not acting in good faith and doesn't care about the Jews.
Okay, so here's Bernie Sanders being asked about all this.
Ask you about hate in this country and concerns around it. As you know, strong concern about anti-Semitism right now. Congresswoman Elise Stefanik had a really pointed question and answer with university presidents this week. One of those presidents has since resigned as a result of the fallout. I wonder your thoughts of how far free speech should be protected when it is calling for genocide.
Why would she do this? She's been better on some things, Margaret Brenner. She has been. Has had a lot of humanitarian people on the show. She's kind of paid some attention to the killing of innocent civilians. But she's going to perpetuate this idea that there are calls for genocide when there haven't been?
Because that's the party line. And if you want to be on corporate TV, you have to parrot the party line. So the party line right now is calling for Palestinian freedom is a call for Jewish genocide. So accordingly, she has to parrot it. Yes, you know, like you can raise concerns about the human rights of Palestinians, about whether enough aid is getting in. But the party line is the party line, and she has to perpetuate it.
And remember, as we've covered in the past, not only is it the call for from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, which is not a genocidal cry, but they also, the same people alleging that we're saying that protesters were saying, we want Jewish genocide. They were saying, we charge you with genocide, not we want you with genocide. Yeah. All right.
Well, I agree. Look, we believe strongly in free speech, and academia is an area where you're going to hear a lot of debate about issues that may make us uncomfortable. But at the end of the day, when somebody is saying they believe in genocide for the Jewish people or racist attacks against Black Americans, or et cetera, that is not acceptable, I think, on a college campus where all of the students, Black, Jewish, whatever, Islamic, have got to feel comfortable on campus.
Bernie's such a dupe. It's really too bad, but he's such a dupe. Everyone's accepting the premise, which is false, that people are calling for genocide of Jews on campus, rather than think for a second, so here's the claim being made. There's a call that there's people calling for Jewish genocide. Then the next question is, what is the evidence for it? Like, what are people, what are these calls? Nobody makes that basic connection. Like, there's a breach right there. And so therefore you can reach all these silly conclusions about how we have to crack down on free speech on campus. And again, who are the actual victims of violence right now on college campuses? They're the people like those 3 Palestinian men in Vermont who were shot. One of them now is paralyzed from the neck down while they were wearing keffiyehs because they're Palestinian.
Or the 6-year-old stabbed to death who was Palestinian. Yes. Or his mother who survived it but was also stabbed.
But note that nobody's calling for cracking down on the free speech rights of Zionists. It's only students calling for Palestinian freedom who have to have their free speech taken away.
Right. Wilson, are you there? Because I sent you a tweet that I thought would be good to show, but if not, I can just read it. But Peter Beinart, who I don't agree with on everything, but he did have a tweet that I thought kind of put this into perspective in terms of why we're hearing so much about this. So he quote tweets a woman named Dalia Hatuka, who tweets, "My friend's mom in Gaza eats a piece of bread and a hot pepper. That's her meal of the day. She hasn't been able to find flour, and so her family has gone without eating for a few days until someone found a bag for them. My other friend's sister hasn't drank any water in 2 days." And Peter Beinart quote tweets that and says, "The campaign to depose university presidents is also an effort to distract people from this," which I think is true. This is just one example of the horrors being inflicted on the people of Gaza. But I think that's an important reminder. This is why we're talking about this issue, because we can't talk about the actual genocide happening. So we have to talk about imaginary calls for genocide.
Okay. Well, because the U.S. is supporting a genocide in Gaza, it's turned its gaze away from its previous top foreign priority, which is the proxy war in Ukraine, which has not been going so well. The counteroffensive that was widely hyped up was a disaster for Ukraine. They barely took any territory. In fact, they probably lost a net amount of territory. And now time is running out. The Biden administration has warned that unless Congress approves a new $60 billion package for Ukraine, they're not going to have any more money to fund the proxy war. So for proxy warriors, this is a disaster. And Republicans are standing in the way because they want to insist on even harsher border militarization efforts. And so Biden is trying to play ball with them before the clock runs out. So here is one of the top supporters of the proxy war, Senator Chris Moon.
Delve into some of the details with you, but give us a gut check. How close are you to a deal? Is this going to get done before the new year, Senator?
I mean, right now, Republican demands are unreasonable. They don't actually get Democratic votes. If I were a cynic, I would say that Republicans have decided to tie support for Ukraine to immigration reform because they want Ukraine aid to fail. But I'm not a cynic. And so we are still trying to resolve some pretty big differences that remain.
You don't sound very optimistic that this is going to get done with the handful of days that you have left.
We are coming up against the end of the year. And of course, this is a crisis moment for Ukraine. Ukraine is running out of ammunition. And if we don't solve this in the next few weeks, Vladimir Putin is going to have an opening to march through the Ukrainian lines to make a move on Kyiv, threatening all of Europe. So this has to be resolved right now, which is why Republicans have to be reasonable. We are not going to solve the entire problem of immigration between now and the end of the year, but we can make a down payment.
Did he say that if we don't act, then Russia is going to march into Ukraine? They already did. That's because we provoked them into a war there. And I understand why they want to prolong it, because if Ukraine, ends up being totally defeated before Biden's election, that will be disastrous for his campaign. And that's why I think they just want to prolong it until then. And Republicans are not playing ball, because even though Republicans are also committed to the proxy war, they don't want to hand Biden another $60 billion to help his reelection campaign. So you do have a little bit of a conflict here. And Zelensky is coming to Washington, D.C. this week to make an appeal. I think they'll probably get it if I were making a prediction, because I do think ultimately Republicans, even though this will help Biden, they're also, this is a hegemonic U.S. project. I don't think they'll cave, but they are making it difficult. And it's kind of funny to see it play out. Because the U.S. has put themselves in this position where, for all the talk about how Ukraine was winning, remember all that talk, Ukraine's on the march. This is exposing all that to be a complete farce, because everyone now knows that unless the U.S. pours in another $60 billion, Ukraine will basically collapse. So, and because the U.S. blocked peace talks up until this point, as we've talked about a million times, before the Russian invasion, after the Russian invasion, now they're in this desperate position. And to underscore that point, here is Secretary of State Tony Blinken.
Congress is scrambling to reach a deal to pass foreign aid for Ukraine and Israel. Republicans are insisting on more border funding and new asylum restrictions that be added to the bill. What would it mean for Ukraine and Israel if Congress does not pass any additional support by the end of the year? And why not agree to tougher border protections, which is an issue of national security as well?
Well, Jake,
Note, by the way, how these talking points, ideological talking points and opinions are just being presented as facts.
Well, okay, so you don't think it's a matter of national security that we need to cage more undocumented immigrants and you know, including children? Yeah, Jake Tapper just accepts all of that. Like, why not? Why not just further militarize the border, make our policies even more inhumane? Why not?
So disgusting.
The border piece, as you know, is out of my purview. But I can say this: I know on day one of this administration, or at least day two, the president put before Congress, I think, the first bill on immigration reform. Unfortunately, Congress hasn't acted on that. In this request for additional funds, there are $6 billion to enhance border security, including having more people, more agents on the border. So I know that's very much part of the discussion and something the president's fully prepared to engage on. But in terms of what it would mean for Ukraine, what it would mean for Israel, what it would mean for our efforts to be competitive in the Indo-Pacific, I think the only people who'd be happy if this supplemental budget request is not voted on and approved by Congress are sitting in Moscow, sitting in Tehran, sitting in Beijing.
Oh my God.
For Ukraine, this is...
It's all the baddies. All the baddies will be happy.
So embarrassing.
All the baddies, everybody in the world will be happy if we don't funnel tens of billions of additional dollars into the military-industrial complex, which, by the way, I believe Blinken's going to give a shout out to over here.
Absolutely.
But at least, you know, at least... Oops, sorry. At least George Bush, who talked about the axis of evil, was entertaining. Blinken's just such a bore. It's like the same weird totalitarian reactionary talking points, but delivered by a dummy, not like a puppet. Yeah.
He does have that
yeah, exactly.
that dummy vibe. Absolutely.
Yeah, the ventriloquism vibe. Yeah.
Over the last year and pushing back Russian aggression, taking back more than 50% of the territory that was seized since February of 2022. But they're in a ferocious battle now in the south and the east. We are running out of funding for them. By the way, 90% of the assistance, the security assistance that we provided Ukraine, is actually invested right here in the United States, to our companies, to our manufacturers. Similarly,
shout out to the military-industrial complex.
Yeah.
They're getting 90% of this money. So that is them trying to appeal to Republicans who don't care about their lofty rhetoric about saving democracy, blah, blah, blah. That doesn't really work for them. So let's just go right to the heart of the issue, which is enriching arms dealers. And that's what they're reduced to doing now. And this, by the way, after claiming for nearly 2 years that Russia's losing. Blinken said a few months ago that Russia's the second strongest army inside Ukraine after everyone thought they were the second strongest army in the world. All these lies to make it look as if Ukraine was winning. That's all now falling apart. And that's why they need more money.
Yeah.
They're just saying, please, please.
It's nice though that he's saying all this war profiteering will trickle down back into the US of A.
Yes. Well, that's what he's reduced to doing because nothing else is working. Okay. And here is Shalonda Young. She's the director of the Office of Management and Budget, also asking Congress for more money for the proxy war.
President going to get more directly involved this week? We know his chief of staff has been involved in these border talks. If this is an emergency, does he need to be more hands-on?
But Congress is having conversations. You heard Senator Lankford's purview. Conversations are happening that need to happen. The one thing I agree with that the senator said is it's time. I sent a letter to Congress outlining the stakes if Ukraine aid is cut off, what that means. The one thing I do take issue with is Americans want their national security taken care of. We agree with that. What happens if Putin marches through Ukraine? What's next? NATO countries. Right. Our sons and daughters are at risk of being a part of a larger conflict. And it's not just Putin, other dictators watching what Congress is doing.
Right.
What signal does that send? So our national security is also influenced with not providing Ukraine.
But you're talking past.
If you dare to let Russian-speaking people inside Ukraine speak Russian and live inside Russia, where a lot of them do actually want to live, then all of a sudden we're going to have somehow American troops fighting Russia in the next war because Putin's not going to be happy with Ukraine. He's going to go on to NATO. It's such a stupid talking point. We heard the same thing in Vietnam, like with the domino theory.
Right, exactly.
It's the same playbook. Nobody believes it anymore. And that's why time's running out. That's why they need to double down with this stuff, because they just need something to keep this war going. And it all could have been avoided had there been just minimally serious diplomacy with Russia before the war and after the war, when a peace deal was blocked by the U.S. in April 2022.
So disgusting.
Yeah. By the way, you still cannot mention on corporate TV that peace deal that Boris Johnson came over to block. And
right.
That, you know,
you think that would be relevant?
Yeah. I wonder when we'll finally get a mention of that. It hasn't happened yet.
Right. Well, is that the last clip we're going to watch for today?
Yes, it is.
Yeah. Well, another story that the media, of course, ignored is something that we want to talk about, which is the assassination of Refaat Alareer, the poet, translator, writer, mentor, husband, father of 6. He and his sister and his sister's children were killed in a targeted attack. Israel targeted the apartment. They didn't bomb the entire building. They just blew up the apartment. Also, it's important to note that Refaat had already lost over 30 relatives. He and his wife lost 30 relatives. And we're just going to show, I wanted to show a short clip of Refaat. And we interviewed him back in October. And it's so tragic and infuriating. He was 44 and his life was cut short. And here he is talking about his kids and the effect of the Israeli assault on his kids. Children, and I was wondering how your children are holding up.
I think there are 15 other children in my small apartment, and this is the case of Gaza. The United Nations, and this is again things that don't easily get understood by non-Gazans, non-Palestinians, unless you listen to Palestinian voices. There are about 200,000 people displaced, sheltering in new unrun schools. But there are probably double this number displaced internally, staying with relatives and family members. This is why the number of casualties are doubled and tripled when Israel bombs homes, because some families happen to be hosting other families, mostly kids. So there's a bit of commotion here. This is the first thing I hear my kids play, 15 kids, what do you expect? But in the first four days, I usually sense some kind of development in the way things happen. These are more bombs, I think. And the first couple of days, usually there is fear and complete horror and terror. The kids can't sleep. They can't do anything. They don't want to go to the bathroom. They don't want to eat. They don't want to drink, and they keep screaming and shrieking, especially at night when they try to catch some sleep, and then they are awakened by more bombs and more bombs. But then the next 2 or 3 days, everybody is numb. We get used to it. We submit to it in a way. We get used to the noise. It's like when you get used, and this is extremely horrible, traumatic. Muhammad quoting statistic that says more than 90% of Palestinians in Gaza children in Palestine, in Gaza, are traumatized. My little Amal is 7 years old, but she's also 3 wars old now.
So, R.I.P. Rest in power, Refaat Alareer. And he does live on in all of his students. He had a lot of students that he mentored. And I was listening to a panel featuring some of his students, and someone said that when Berta Cáceres, the Honduran activist, was killed, people said she wasn't killed, she multiplied. And during this panel, they said the same thing about him. So,
and if you want to hear more about his life and legacy, soon after this show ends, at the Electronic Intifada's YouTube page, they are going to be doing a tribute to him. And he worked with Electronic Intifada, and I think they'll be bringing on many of his students, because Refaat taught literature at university and changed the lives of so many people, enriched the lives of so many people in Gaza and all around the world. And so they'll be doing a tribute to him. If you want to watch that, that is
at noon.
Noon Eastern time at the Electronic Intifada's YouTube page.
And I'll also be talking to some of his students Tuesday night I think I'm going to accommodate their schedules. It'll probably be at 8 p.m. instead of 7 p.m., but at youtube.com/The Katie Halper Show.
All right, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in. We appreciate it. We'll see you next time.
Bye.